Everyone's been talking about the interview that Tucker Carlson did with Ambassador Mike Huckabee, and I'd like to touch on two issues that came up in that interview in this video, and they came up one right after the other. The first issue is that of the biblical borders of the Promised Land, and the second one that we'll deal with is the issue of the Jewish identity of today's Jews. So let's go ahead and take a look at that first clip.
You'll hear me say is I'm confused by what the definitions are. So let's go through this. You've appealed to Genesis. Genesis 15 says it's Abram, it's pre-Abraham, it's Abram, receives from God the news that his descendants will inherit the land. And you tell me as the theologian if I'm getting this wrong, but from the Euphrates to the Nile. I think that's right. And that would include like basically the entire Middle East. That would be the Levant. So that would be Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. It would also be big parts of Saudi Arabia and Iraq. It would be,
I'm not sure it would go that far. I mean, it would be a big piece of land, but here's the point.
It would be a lot of places that are now countries.
But this particular area that we're talking about now, Israel, is a land that God gave through Abraham to a people that he chose. It was a people, a place, and a purpose. We can look at it that way. Christian Zionism, I want to go back because that's where we started.
I'm not going to let you off on this because you have said it 3 times that God gave this land to this people. And so it is entirely fair for me with respect to ask, what land are you talking about? Because I just read Genesis 15, as I have many times. Mm-hmm. And that land, I think it says, from the Nile to the Euphrates, which is, once again, basically the entire Middle East. So God gave that land to his people, the Jews, or he didn't. You're saying he did. What does that mean? Does Israel have the right to that land? Because you're appealing to Genesis.
Yeah.
You're saying that's the original deed.
It would be fine if they took it all. But I don't think that's what we're talking about here today.
What would be fine? Well, it's exactly what we're talking about today.
But here's what I don't think
you think it would be fine if the state of Israel took over all of Jordan?
They don't want to take it over. They're not asking to take it over.
But you're saying that the reason that Israel is legitimate, has this inherent right to exist, is in part because God gave it to his people. And I am going to the same Bible that you're referring to and noticing that that is a huge piece of land. So if God gave them that land, then they have a right to take it now by your definition, unless I'm missing something completely.
Well, I think you're missing something because they're not asking to go back to take all of that, but they are asking to at least take the land that they now occupy, they now live in, they now own legitimately, and it is a safe haven for them.
Well, but may I ask though,
Okay. I do not think that Ambassador Huckabee handled this well. He was avoiding the question. He was dodging. Tucker was asking him about the Nile to the Euphrates and what he believes about that. Let me make this very clear. The correct answer, the answer that Ambassador Huckabee should have given, the answer that I would have given if someone asks, hey, the Bible says that you have the right from the Nile to the Euphrates. I would say, well, the very same Bible, like one book later in the book of Exodus, which is not, I mean, it's a few chapters later, basically, consider, in comparison to the whole Bible. The nation of Israel leaves Egypt. It's called the Exodus. Now tell me, when they leave Egypt, you read the Bible, when they leave Egypt and they've just crossed the Red Sea and they're in the desert, are they already in the promised land? Like according to the narrative in the Bible, are they already in the promised land? No, they're not. Wait a second. They're between the Nile and the Euphrates. Why isn't it considered that they're already in the promised land? Let me go further with this point. At the end of the book of Numbers, the nation of Israel is on the east side of the Jordan River, well within the boundaries between the Nile and the Euphrates. And the 2 tribes of Reuven and Gad ask permission to not enter the promised land and instead to settle on the eastern bank of the Jordan River. And they're rebuked by Moses for their request. But wait a second. They're between the Nile and the Euphrates. Why are they being rebuked? This is already the promised land. But to take this even further, Moses, for committing a sin of hitting the rock for the water to come out instead of speaking to it, God punishes him and Aaron. But he punishes Moses and explicitly says to him that he will not enter the land because of his sin. And then this is in the final scene of Moses' life, right at the very, very end of the book of Deuteronomy, right before Moses dies. God said to him, you can look at the land from here, but you cannot enter the promised land. You're not allowed to enter the promised land. Well, here's the problem, Tucker. Moses is standing on the eastern bank of the Jordan River. He is between the Nile and the Euphrates. Why is it not considered that he's already in the promised land if the promised land is from the Nile to the Euphrates? And the answer is that Genesis 15 says what it says. It says what Tucker says it says. But the rest of the Bible does not treat from the Nile to the Euphrates as the promised land in any way. At no point. And at no point did the nation of Israel lay claim from the Nile to the Euphrates. The Bible itself, you could say it contradicts itself. You could say we have an exegesis problem that we now have to solve. Why does it not consider that Moses was in the promised land because he was between the Nile and the Euphrates? Why were the tribes of Reuben and Gad rebuked for not wanting to enter the promised land when they were between the Nile and the Euphrates? Why were the people of Israel not yet in the promised land when they left Egypt when they were between the Nile and the Euphrates? We could ask that question. That's a biblical exegesis question. It has nothing to do with any claims, even the biblical claim that is made on the land of Israel by the descendants of Abraham. Okay, so I hope that answer was clear. Let's go take a look now at the second clip that I wanted to share with you.
The first question was the borders. I can't get an answer.
Yeah.
Those borders are. So I'm going to give up. But the second question is every bit as pressing, which is who are the people? Who are the modern? Yes. Who are the descendants? So we know, and I believe, and I agree with you as a Christian, that God promised this land from modern day Iraq to modern day Egypt to this people, the Jews, to Abram's, actually not to Abram's descendants, as it says in Genesis 15. Who are his descendants now, and how do we know who they are?
I think they're the Jews, and we know who they are because they've always been a Jewish people. There has been an unbroken line of Jewish people, and they've lived in this land for 3,800 years. Sometimes not very many of them because they were chased out all over the world. They were hunted down. They were almost annihilated during the Holocaust. They came back. To this day, Tucker, they represent, you know how many Jews there are in the whole world?
Please,
No,
I understand. But first of all, the greatest genocide of Jews no one ever mentions was by the Romans, where they were literally banned from Jerusalem for 500 years.
Yeah, of course.
And it's all awful. And I'm opposed to all of that. I'm opposed to mass killing of anybody, period. I'm opposed to
hear
killing.
you say that.
I mean it.
Yeah.
And I hope
I
we can
believe
agree
that.
on that.
I believe that.
My question is, and it's not a bumper sticker answer, it's a sincere answer. How do we know? Because what you're saying is that certain people have a title to a highly contested region. They own it in some deep sense. So I think it's fair to ask, who are they and how do we know? So the current prime minister's ancestors weren't from here within recorded history. He has no deed. Bibi Netanyahu, on one side, his family's from Poland. They're from Eastern Europe. So how do we know that he has a connection to the people who God promised the land to, Abram's descendants? How do we know that?
Well, if you take the genealogies that come not only from the Old, but the New Testament, you see that there is a historical connection through the entirety of the Old and the New Testament that details the Jewish connection to this land.
Does that include
that's
Bibi's
indisputable.
family? How do we know that if his family
If they were
comes here,
scattered,
but how do we know it's the
the-
same people? Why is that crazy? If you say to me,
if they speak the same language, if they worship the same God, if they follow the same Bible, if they follow the same cultures and traditions, and they always pray next year in Jerusalem, and they pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and they pray facing toward Jerusalem, does that not give you a little bit of a clue as to who they are?
Let's go through those things, because I would like to have a rational, this is a conversation I've wanted. Bless you. Thank you for doing this. Let's just go through those things.
Okay.
So one of the things I admire most about Israel is they resurrected a dead language in 1948. Good for them.
Well, they really didn't resurrect it. It was existent.
Okay, that's a compliment. I'm not slighting.
No, but it is the first time in all of human history that a language has survived through this length of time. It's. I would call it. You might not, but I would call it a miracle. One of many.
Okay,
that you can attribute to this.
I think it's wonderful as someone who loves language. Netanyahu's parents did not speak Hebrew. Okay, they didn't live in this region. Netanyahu, the founders of this country, were mostly secular. Some of them were avowed atheists. They were not praying for the peace of Jerusalem. They weren't praying at all because they didn't believe in God. There's no genealogy linking their families to the people of this land 3,000 years ago. They're none. So how do we know, since they didn't share a language, they didn't share a religion, they had no religion whatsoever, how do we know that they had a right to come here from Eastern Europe and
but they were
take
scattered.
the land?
They were scattered to Eastern Europe. They were scattered all over the world. There were many in Ethiopia. They were in Russia. They were in Poland. They were throughout Asia. Jews were all over the place, but they were still Jews. But they were still Jews.
Okay, so then let me get to the nub of the question, since again, a lot is at stake, a lot of money is at stake. Land is very valuable. Israel has a lot of resources. By the way, if you're accused of a crime, you can hide here. That's a pretty good passport to have. It's a good thing, right? So who's entitled to it? I don't understand, and you're very discouraged in the United States from asking this question for some reason. It's a totally rational
I'm
question.
not discouraged.
No, you're not discouraging
Yeah.
me. Others do. You're like the only person I can have this conversation with. Everyone else will be like, shut up, Nazi. It's a foundational question. Are you speaking of an ethnic group or a religious group?
Well, I think you're looking at, for many people, it is religious. There are people who may not have a deep religious connection to Judaism, but they're still Jews.
Okay, so it's an ethnic category.
It is ethnic, but it is also religious. It is rooted in religion. You can't take it out of it. Now, that means
then how can an atheist...
Well, I will tell you this. There are some people who say, I'm Christian. They never go to church. They never pray. They never read their Bible. They don't tithe.
But they're not entitled to citizenship on the basis of that.
Well,
they're
but
not
I'm saying
entitled to...
They still call themselves Christian, even though they identify in that way.
Here's the difference. You're saying that people who have this identification have a deed to a huge chunk of land on the Mediterranean. Okay, so there's, it's a right. You keep telling me it's a right, and so it's totally fair to say if you come to my house and say I've got the title to your house, I get to ask, may I see it? Where'd you get it? And that's exactly what happened here. People from Europe, Eastern Europe, came here, in a lot of cases atheists, and kicked out a lot of people who lived here.
Land.
Well, but
they did not just throw people out.
They bought a lot of land. There's no question about that.
They did buy a lot of land.
But they also, in 1948, kicked out a lot of people.
In the war.
It was a war. I agree.
Yeah.
I don't want to relitigate the history. I'm just saying it's a fact.
Okay.
Including a lot of Christians wound up fleeing, and they lost their homes, and they've never been allowed back. And all of this was justified on the basis of this identity that is the ticket to the right that you keep referring to. So my question is very simple. I'm going to wait patiently for an answer. Does this right derive from religious affiliation or from genetics?
And I would say it's both.
Okay. There's a lot to unpack in this clip. A lot to unpack here. So, Tucker's actually raising a real question. Is this an ethnicity? Is it a religion? What exactly is Jewish identity? It's a good question, and I don't think Ambassador Huckabee handles it well at all. Other than the last word that he says that it's both, but considering what he was saying before about Christians who don't practice and they still identify as Christians, which is a bad analogy because Christianity is not a nationality, it's only a faith. So again, I don't think that Ambassador Huckabee handled this question well. And considering that Tucker has been talking about this issue and he's talked about it in other contexts, this is where I really am critical of Ambassador Huckabee for this interview, because it tells me that he did not properly prepare. Because this answer, I don't know about you, but listening to that answer, if I was someone sympathetic to the question that Tucker was asking, I would not be satisfied by the answer he gave. So let me give you my take on this. So the problem that we have here is that the Jewish people are not, they're not an ethnicity. You cannot convert to an ethnicity, but you can join the Jewish people. And they are not only a religion. Ambassador Huckabee's right. People can have a Jewish identity even though they don't practice the religion. So what are the Jewish people? The Jewish people are, in one word, and I'll explain what I mean, a nation. A nation, okay? You can join a nation if you, let's start with the joining a nation, okay? You can join a nation if you move to the land, you accept, you declare your allegiance to the laws of that land, and you are accepted in, and you become part of that nation. Once you're part of that nation, if you then commit crimes and you don't follow the laws of that land, you don't get kicked out of being part of the nation. You're still part of the nation. So nationality is not the same as ethnicity, and it's not the same as religion. Let me give you another way to look at this. In the ancient world, which is when the Jewish people began, in the ancient world, nations, ethnicities, nations had gods. A lot of gods were national gods. You lived in a certain land, that nation had a god. And generally what happened was when people would move to a land, and if they were joining up with that nation, like let's say a woman marrying in was the standard way that someone might switch nations. People move to another land, they become part of that nation, they start worshiping that god. That's how you become part of a nation. Think about Ruth's conversion in the book of Ruth. Her conversion isn't a conversion like we do it today. She simply went to the land of Israel with her mother-in-law. She declared, your God is my God, your people are my people. She became part of the nation of Israel. That's what being part of a nation means. The Jewish people are a nation, and they're an ancient nation, and therefore the paradigm of what the Jewish people are doesn't actually fit the paradigms that people have today of religions and ethnicities and nationalities. Okay, it doesn't work well. And especially because the Jewish people remained a distinct nation while scattered in exile. It breaks the paradigm. Oh, lo and behold, the Jewish people don't fit the paradigm of history. So it can be confusing. I sympathize with Tucker. A lot of Jews don't understand this. Joining the Jewish people is very much joining up with a nation. Now, being in exile for a couple thousand years, a lot of Jews started to think of Judaism only as a religion. And also the Jewish people were in exile, scattered for a long time. And that's why the genetics it's not really a relevant point. Think of it as, here's another way to look at it. Think of it as a corporate entity. You have a company, and people join the company, they leave the company, they get fired, they get hired. The entity continues to exist, and people join it and leave it. But the entity continues to exist, and it has possessions, it has a life of its own. It has, right? It is an entity. So the Jewish people is a nation. It's a national entity. It remained a national entity while in exile, still laying claim to a land that it always pointed to. The Jewish people never gave up on its claim to the land of Israel, declaring it all the time, not only in liturgy, but in books and publicly. Everyone knew that the people of Israel laid claim to the land of Israel throughout the history of the exile, and there was never any other sovereign entity, local sovereign entity in the land of Israel. When I say local sovereign entity meaning the land of Israel throughout the exile was always governed by some external invading empire. Okay? The Jewish people are a nation. Okay? They're a nation, and that's why this whole thing of the DNA testing, it's not a relevant point. Because you can join a nation even if you don't have the same DNA. You can join a nation. And nations in the ancient world had gods. So the people of Israel have their God, the God of Israel, and they are a people. And you can have people in that nation who don't worship and don't follow the laws that God gives. That doesn't mean they're not part of the nation anymore. Okay? So what we have here to some extent is an ancient construct that's difficult to translate into the way that Christians in the modern world think about religion and nation. Okay, that's one point here. Another important point. Tucker brought up this issue of, okay, like, who are the Jews today? Because there's the children of Abraham and the Jews. Are these Jews the same? He's talking about, Prime Minister Netanyahu comes from Poland. So I want to tell you a little story. A number of years ago, I work in the field of Jewish Christian relations, and I was invited by a Presbyterian pastor from Wyoming to speak at a church, to speak in Wyoming. Now, why is that strange? Because the Presbyterian church, this Presbyterian pastor was from the PCUSA, which is the main Presbyterian denomination in America. There was a breakaway of the more conservative wing a number of years ago. This is from the more progressive wing. The PCUSA is quite anti-Israel. But this Presbyterian pastor wanted to hear my voice and hear a voice from Israel, and she invited me to come out to her church in Wyoming. She was going to get together with a few other churches to host an event where I would speak, okay, represent Israel. And because the Presbyterian church is hierarchical, she asked permission from the state presbyter of Wyoming for me to come speak. The state presbyter, a progressive, a leftist, whatever you want to call, was not happy with the request, but didn't want to say no, didn't want to have some disgruntled pastors. So he reluctantly agreed. Now, in his reluctant agreement, he expressed it in an email to this pastor. And in this email, he reluctantly allowed me to speak and gave certain stipulations about the talk, which are not relevant here. But the email opened with the following line. Now, I don't think he thought that this pastor would show me the email, but she did. And I used it in an opinion piece that I wrote in the Jerusalem Post about this incident shortly after it took place. So here's the quote. So I have it right here. He wrote, "I don't think the Old Testament nation of Israel and the present day nation of Israel are equivalent, nor should they be in my estimation." Okay, that was what this state presbyter said. I found this fascinating. It's a fascinating statement that I don't think the current people of Israel, the current Jews, are the same as the ancient Jews of the Bible. This is a claim that is very recent, and it's what Tucker's implying also, that the Jews of today aren't necessarily the descendants of the ancient Jewish people. Now, what's fascinating about this claim, there are two things that are fascinating to me about it. Number one, it is extremely easy to disprove, and I'll do that in a moment. It's extremely easy to disprove. The second thing that's fascinating about it is that no one ever made this claim until extremely recently. So let's deal with the disproving first. So it's easy to disprove because, unbeknownst to Tucker Carlson, I'm sure, there is an unbroken chain. Now, Huckabee alluded to this. He talked about, you have this chain of generations in the Old Testament and the New Testament, but that's not so convincing. There's literally an unbroken chain of Jewish tradition going all the way back to biblical times. Let me show you something here. This is one of many lists that are available. This is a list of Jewish tradition. It starts Moses, Joshua, Phineas or Pinchas, Eli, Samuel, David. Okay, these are all people who knew each other. Okay, and you see it has the dates here. So there is an unbroken chain, pretty much teacher to student, generation to generation, every single century, going all the way from Moses all the way down to the 20th century or the 21st century, all the way down to now. This list ends in 1936 with some rabbis, and then you can just continue it because we know exactly who these people were and who their students were. Let me say this again. Let me be very clear. There is literally an unbroken chain, teacher to student, that is on record from Moses all the way down till today. There might be some very small gaps where we don't have names. There are different lists that people have compiled to show this. Let me simplify it. We have books and records of Jewish communal life from every single century, from an unbroken chain. It's easily trackable. The Jewish people know exactly where we've been. We know exactly who we are. So anyone claiming, it's not like the Jewish people vanished and now there's some new group of people said that they're Jews. Okay? It's totally continuous, which means that if you want to claim that the Jews of today, like this state presbyter claimed, and like Tucker was implying, that the Jews of today are not the Jews of the Bible, show me where the lie begins. Are the Jews of today not the descendants of the Jews of the 18th century or the 17th century? Tucker wouldn't claim that because, the genealogy is recorded. Okay, are the Jews of the 16th century not the same as the Jews of the 14th century? How about the Jews of the 12th century not the same as the Jews of the 14th century? You can go down one of these lists and you see it's an unbroken chain. Where does the lie begin? You can't answer this question. And that's why there is not a single legitimate historian who makes the claim that the Jews today are not the descendants of the Jews of a long time ago. But a lot of people popularly make this claim, like Tucker Carlson is making, and it works on people. The reason that it works is that most people today in the Western world do not themselves identify with any ancient people. They've lost those connections. When I speak to Christian groups, I illustrate this point to them by doing the following experiment. I'll ask the group, I'll say, is anyone here of of Greek descent? And sometimes a hand goes up, or I'll say, is anyone here of Italian descent? And then I'll ask these people, when you're reading the history of ancient Rome or the history of ancient Greece, depending on what the person's origins, do you feel like, do you identify that you're reading your own personal family history? And they almost always say no. No, they just don't think that way. People nowadays in the Western world don't think of themselves as part of a direct line from anyone of the ancient world, even though technically they are. This is not true for people, let's say, from China, who never went into exile and they've been in their land since ancient times. They do have this identification historically, but Westerners, especially Americans, don't really feel connected to anyone from the ancient world. And therefore, it's easy for people to believe this. When someone says, oh, the Jews today, they're not the same as the Jews of the Bible, it's easy for someone who doesn't know the history to just believe that that's true, because it sounds true. But they don't know that there's an unbroken chain of the records of Jewish communities going all the way back to temple times. And it's kind of empirical that we are the same corporate entity. We're the same people. People join it and people leave it, but it's the same nation. It's the same entity. And therefore, this whole question of DNA or ethnicity is just not a relevant point. The Jewish people as a people group has always existed. And I said the second aspect of this that's so interesting is that no one ever made this claim before. What do I mean? You could read the works of Luther, who lived in the 16th century, right? And he's talking about the Jews and talking about how they should, if they ever go back to their land. Here, I'll share with you a quote. Here's something that Luther wrote about the Jews. Okay, I quoted it in that same article I just mentioned before that I wrote. Here's a quote from Luther. Let them go to the land and to Jerusalem, build the temple, raise up the priesthood, the principality of Moses with his law, so that they again become Jews and possess the land. If that happened, they should soon see us on their heels and also become Jews. And that's one of many quotes of Luther about the Jews and the land of Israel. And it was a common anti-Semitic attitude of, the Jews belong in the land of Israel. They should go back to the land of Israel. That was what people said about the Jews before we had a state of Israel. My point being that even virulent Jew haters like Martin Luther, who wrote an entire book called On the Jews and Their Lies, never claimed, even though he didn't like the Jews, he never claimed that the Jews of his day were not the Jews of the Bible. No one ever made that claim before. That's interesting. No one was ever saying, oh, these Jews aren't the real Jews. Why not? And that was only a few hundred years ago. Why was no one ever making that claim? This claim is brand new. We're talking within the last half century is when it first started surfacing that people would claim that modern Jews are not the real Jews. It's really, really brand new. It's kind of, I believe it's a direct response to the existence and success of the state of Israel. Let me explain. You see, if you believe in the Bible, or even if you don't believe in the Bible, if you believe in just historical rights, if the Jewish people are the same as the Jewish people of the Bible, we are the same, we are an extension, we're the same nation, then you're forced to face the fact that the Jewish people has returned to the Jewish homeland. You have no choice but to accept that as a fact because you see the Jewish people as the Jewish people. So if you believe in the Bible and it says that the Jewish people will return to their land, but Christianity, for a long time, the dominant theology was replacement theology, that the Jews have lost their covenant. That's what Augustine said, that the Jews have lost their covenant and will never go back. So if your belief is that the Jews are not, lost their covenant and will never go back. So if you're Luther living in the 15th century, 16th century, and you say, well, the Jews are never going back, I have no problem believing that the Jews are the Jews, but they just lost their covenant. They still, they're still the Jewish people. But once the Jews go back to their land, we're stuck because you either have to acknowledge that the Jewish people have returned after a long exile in fulfillment of the biblical prophecies, or how do you get out of that if you believe in the Bible? How do you get around the fact that the Jewish people have returned and therefore the promises to the people of Israel are real and still in force, and replacement theology was wrong? How do you get around that problem? There's only one way to get around it. You have to deny that the Jewish people have returned to their land. The only way to deny that is to say that the Jews of today aren't actual Jews. That's where this is coming from. Okay? That's where this is coming from. So there's a direct connection between this claim that the Jews are not really the Jews, like that state presbyter in Wyoming said, and the rejection of Zionism, because, again, the alternative, if you're going to profess to be a Christian who believes in the Bible, and you have to agree that the nation of Israel still has a biblical right, still has a covenant with God, or because they've actually returned from exile. You have to acknowledge that Augustine's prediction theologically that the Jews would never go back was incorrect. So to get out of it, you have to deny that the Jews are the Jews. So I think that's part of the motivation that's going on here. A lot more to say on this topic, but this video has gone on a bit too long already. I'm going to leave it there. Please let me know what you think of what I said here. And if you found this helpful, please make sure to like and share this video with other people, because this is a topic, both these two topics I dealt with in this video, I think a lot of people are getting wrong. So I wanted to put this out there. I hope you found this helpful. Please drop me a comment. Let me know what you thought of what I said here, and make sure that that we spread this far and wide. And I want to thank all of you, thank everyone in this audience for helping grow the channel. Please tell people about what we're doing here. And please, of course, make sure to check out all the great content that we're putting up at Israel 365 News YouTube channel as well. God bless.